Ayrton Senna was a genius in the wet, we all know that, but recently I saw a stat that surprised me. This is Senna's win ratio in the rain. He won more than half of the wet races he took part in, and that's significantly more than the other drivers known for being quick in the wet, like Schumacher, Hamilton and Verstappen. So we know that Senna had incredible car control, but why was he so good in the wet? Well, in this video I'm going to break down Senna's driving to explain how he was so dominant.
That's a sensational lap from Ayrton Senna.
Ayrton Senna.
Ayrton Senna.
Ayrton Senna. Senna.
Senna.
Now, you might expect Senna to have been a complete natural in the wet, but that wasn't always the case.
I never forget my first race in the wet with go-kart was a disaster. Just complete joke. I couldn't do any good. And people were going here, going there, passing me, overtaking me, and I couldn't do anything about it. And in the dry I was pretty good. So then on that day I learned that I knew nothing about running the wet.
But rather than seeing this experience negatively, it actually lit a fire in the young Ayrton Senna. He set to turn this weakness into a strength. Every time it rained, he'd be out there practicing, pushing himself to understand every part of wet driving. And this taught Ayrton a deeper lesson, exactly how he needed to work. Instead of hoping to get better, he got systematic about it. He'd analysed every aspect of wet weather driving, testing his limits over and over until he understood exactly what made the difference between spinning off and being fast. But it wasn't just about the rain. This became his whole approach to racing. Find your weak points, face them head on and turn them into strengths. When other drivers saw the rain as a problem, Senna saw it as an opportunity to be better than everybody else. In his mind, every race should be wet because he had an edge. Jump forward a decade from his karting years and all that practice was about to pay off. Wet races defined Ayrton Senna's career, but one race in particular announced his arrival to Formula 1. The 1984 Monaco Grand Prix started in torrential rain.
But today nature has thrown a question mark over the Grand Prix of Monaco. As you can see, it's pouring rain. Despite that fact, 100,000 people and more are gathered here.
Now, this story has been told many times, so I'll be quick. He started from 13th position in an uncompetitive Toleman car, but Senna began to show his skill. As the rain got worse, he made his way through the field with incredible car control, and by lap 19, he'd climbed to second place and was catching the leader Alain Prost. But just as victory seemed possible, officials stopped the race and Senna finished second while Prost took the win.
Did the checkered flag and the red flag come perhaps too late, or did you feel the decision was correct at that moment?
I think it's the best decision I've never seen in Formula 1.
However, even though Senna didn't win, Formula 1 had witnessed his arrival. Then, 1 year after Monaco, with Senna now in a Lotus car, he dominated the field at a very wet Portuguese Grand Prix.
He went out there and he just blew everybody else away. It was one of the motor races of all time, not for closeness of competition, exactly the reverse, but anyone who stood there that day and saw him drive away from a field of some of the most fierce competitors that Formula 1 has seen cannot fail to have been impressed.
That's Peter Waugh, team manager at Lotus at the time, and this Grand Prix was one that Senna also remembered fondly.
One of my best moments from my whole career is the first victory in Formula 1. Again, Portugal in the rain, bad conditions. I have done the first pole position of my career and in Formula 1 and also the first victory. One of the best, if not the best moment of my whole career.
In qualifying, Senna was almost half a second faster than Prost in second, but in the race, he was in a completely different class. By lap 20, he was already 30 seconds ahead of the field, in incredibly difficult conditions, with many drivers aquaplaning or spinning off the circuit. And by the end of the race, Senna was over a minute ahead of the next driver, lapping everyone apart from second position. But for me, one of Senna's most incredible wet performances was at Donington in 1993, the lap of the gods. I just love this lap and this race. Donington is my home circuit, where I used to hold the outright lap record, and Senna's special lap happened when I was just 8 years old, so it's etched in my memory. Senna entered the first corner in 5th position, but by the end of the first lap he was first, having overtaken Schumacher, Wendlinger, Hill and Prost, like they were standing still.
I think on those first 2 laps he won the race then and sacked the opposition in a form that they would everybody destroyed. There was no racing anymore. And that was fantastic.
That's Joe Ramirez, sporting manager at McLaren at the time. And he's right, Senna destroyed the field and finished 1 minute and 23 seconds ahead of Hill in second and lapping everybody else. But how did he do this? Well, I'm going to break that down in a bit and I'll talk you through his techniques. But here's what Senna said specifically about that race.
You have to be very sharp all the time to understand the situations as they present to you and not be hesitating. And I was sharp at that occasion, in particular that occasion, and I took all the decisions like that in the right way, with the precise measure, and everything came together. And that was from the green light, basically.
And one more interesting thing about this race was not just that Senna set the fastest lap, but he did it through the pit lane. Take a look at Donington's track map. This is the pit lane and this is the final corner. The pit lane route to the finishing line is significantly shorter than the track. And remember, back then, incredibly, there were no pit lane speed limits. So Senna kept this trick in his pocket. Initially in case he wasn't leading so he could move up the field, but he already had a huge lead in this race, so ended up using the trick to take the fastest lap of the race on lap 57, again demonstrating his incredible attention to detail. So let's get into the technique, and as you might expect, there's not one single answer, rather many things that all come together to form the greatest wet weather driver of all time. By the way, if you've ever dreamed of working in motorsport, it's actually more achievable than you might think. Just search for our sister site Fluid Jobs, where we list hundreds of opportunities in racing. And if you want to boost your chances of landing that motorsport job, take our readiness quiz. It'll map out your path to that dream career. Links in the description below. Now, back to the video. First off, and the same as today, he had to have a good, well set up car. And late 80s and early 90s F1 cars are arguably the most difficult F1 cars to drive and set up. I've been lucky enough to drive plenty of F1 cars from the early 80s and up to the mid 2010s. And the early 90s cars, especially in the wet, are the most difficult. They're the most likely to throw you off into a barrier. The thing is, these cars were powerful. In 1993, the McLaren Ford was at almost 700 horsepower, and the Williams Renault at about 770. Now, that is a long way from the 1,000 horsepower of today's cars, but when you look at the power to weight ratio, it's a different story. Today's weight limit is around 800 kilos, but back then, cars weighed less than 500. So that means an early 90s F1 car has a power to weight ratio of almost 1,600 horsepower per tonne. But a 2024 car only has about 1,300 horsepower per tonne. Add to that the unsophisticated 90s suspension, flat floors, and less than perfect paddle shift systems, and you get an absolute monster to hold on to. And Senna definitely got the most out of all of his cars, like the Tolman, but the 93 McLaren, while down on power, was sophisticated with regards to electronics. It had good traction control. In fact, Senna was very open and very humble about that race at Donington, saying that people later said that my win in the wet at Donington in 93 was my greatest performance. No way, I had traction control. Okay, I didn't make any real mistakes, but the car was so much easier to drive. It was a good win, sure, but compared with Estoril 85, it was nothing really. But of course, drivers have a huge influence on how good a car is, whether that's leading the engineers in the right direction or guiding them on setup at a particular race. And this is something vital in wet conditions, and something Senna excelled at.
All he wanted to do was to talk about how to set the car up for the wet, how to get the best out of it in the wet, how to get the engine running so that it was as smooth and responsive as it could be in the wet.
Without the aid of millions of data points engineers have to analyse these days, driver feedback was much more important during Senna's time. And compared to the other drivers, he could make a massive difference. But what about his actual driving? Well, let's start with his feel.
The car is an extension of you. It's an extension of your body, because you are tight as part of it. And as more part of it you can be and you can feel, more sensitive you be to the actions and reactions and of it, and therefore better you are going to exploit it.
And Donington in '93 was an incredible example of his feel, and in turn his confidence. During lap 1, a driver is always acting on their instincts. It's always so busy off the grid and you're heading into the unknown. The car's a different weight, the tyres have likely cooled, and you have more cars close to you than at any other time during the race. But it's 10 times harder in the rain. The rain brings different grip levels on each part of the circuit, even at each point during a corner, and whether you're on or off the normal racing line. It's about searching for grip and figuring out the complex balance and compromise of the best racing line. All in a time before lap time deltas helped drivers. And that's what was so great about Donington in '93. It was about as hard as it could have been. And yes, Senna was in a good car, but he drove around the others like they were backmarkers. Now, I'd love to break down the onboard frame by frame, but I can't use any of that footage. So for now, we'll have to use images. Then after this video, head over to the Formula 1 channel and watch the onboard yourself. It's amazing. I'll put the link in the description. So Senna actually gets a bad start from 4th position and then gets muscled down to 5th by a feisty Schumacher. However, you see Senna dart across to the inside under braking, and this is the first sign he's thought about the extra grip. On the inside going into Redgate, there's much less rubber embedded into the track, and so it generally has more grip in the wet. On the exit, Senna again stays on the inside, not the normal racing line, but an effort to stay off the rubber and propel himself down the next straight. Then we move down to the Craner curves, one of the best sequences of corners in an F1 car. And Senna knows what he's doing. He dives to the outside around Wendlinger. Here, again on the outside, there's more grip, but this is a heroic move. It's very risky, especially on the first lap when you've not been on that piece of track before. The amount of grip the track is going to give you is a complete estimation. And the problem with taking that karting line around the outside is that if you make a mistake and you go in a little bit too fast, there's very little margin for error. You'll easily just fall straight onto the grass. Anyway, of course, Senna predicts this grip perfectly and he's up into P3. Then through the left-hander towards Starkey's Bridge, it's obvious how much confidence Senna has as he catches Hill very quickly in an area where the Williams should be faster. Towards the back of the track, Senna returns to the normal racing line, and here there is actually a dry line which is offering him more grip, and he overtakes Hill. Then on the brakes into the chicane, he steams up to the back of Prost, again showing his supreme confidence. Then into the penultimate corner, the track again is very wet, and Senna lunges up the inside off the rubber and moves into first position. All on the first lap of a short 2.5 mile Donington Park. The key thing here is Senna's ability to estimate the amount of grip available and then to fully use it straight away without ending up off the track. And remember, it was even more risky back then because this was the time before acres of asphalt runoff. If you made a mistake back then, it was likely going to end your race. So the race continues with drier, then wetter, then drier conditions again. It was a race where the grip levels never stayed the same, and due to the changing conditions, Prost made 7 pit stops and Senna made 4.
I don't know how many times we stopped for tires. I think it's surely the record in any race of pit stops. Driving with slicks in damp and really slippery conditions was tremendous effort because you just don't get the feeling from the car and you have to commit yourself to certain corners and you just can be off. So I had to gamble on this It paid off.
Now, even though he says he wasn't getting the feeling from the car, it's all relative. He wasn't getting as much feel as you do in the dry. That's why the wet is more difficult. But he was obviously getting some feel of grip levels, and definitely a better feel and more confidence than most of the other drivers. But it's not all about feel and confidence. To win more than half your wet races, you need absolute focus.
His total ability to concentrate when he's in that car, whether it's testing, qualifying or racing, to me was like a mobile computer. He could recall test days, he could do this, and it really got me G'd up more to look into every fine detail, because I felt he was putting in 110% and we were putting in 100%, so we went to 110% as well.
In the wet, if you miss a braking point by a few meters, you'll likely be out of the race. You need to be entirely focused. There is no room for mistakes. And it was this ability to focus, combined with massive mental capacity, that set Senna apart.
One of the things that was most awe-inspiring about him as a race driver was his ability somehow to detach his mind from the physical requirements of driving the car, with the result that his mind was fully functional even on a pole position lap. And he could come back and he could recall it in the most minute detail, and the engineers from Renault and subsequently Honda were absolutely aghast, because what he told them was what the printout on the data logger was showing.
But to be truly quick in the wet, you might think that you need to be brave. You know, take a deep breath in and fly into a corner. And while I was coaching, that was a common misconception, but it's definitely not how you should be driving. If you need to be brave, that means you're not entirely sure of whether the car's going to stick when you put it into that corner. Those drivers who are fast understand how the car is going to react, and so they don't need to be brave.
Being wet, it's always a tremendous risk to lose the car control, or somebody lose the car control and you get involved into an accident. But better if you feel in control of what you're doing and in command of the situation, so you dictate the moves and you make things happen instead of waiting for other people making errors or waiting for other people to making moves. I rather decide the strategy myself if I can and establish my own pace in the race.
And because of his confidence in his ability to control his cars, the rain didn't faze Senna, even from the beginning of his F1 career, as Peter Wall points out from the 1985 season.
We had this terrible weather, and I would have thought that most racing drivers could have been completely fazed by having got to the point where the promise might have been aborted by these terrible conditions. And so my lasting memory is that it did not faze him at all.
But for me, the biggest thing that influenced Senna's ability in the wet was his mindset. He was humble, he was honest, and he knew how to learn from his mistakes.
There is so much to learn and to do it, I believe. That for me, the only way to be stronger and to be more self-confident that I'm doing really the maximum that I can do under those circumstances is by concentrating and trying to remember every single detail regarding that situation and to imagine any future problems, and therefore get it as right as possible. And you develop it through the year, through the time you develop.
From my own experience, I always said that it didn't matter whether you were on pole by a second or whether you were 17th on the grid 3 seconds off the pace. The task is always the same. How do we find time? How do we lap faster? How do we become better? And perhaps most tellingly, Senna understood that excellence wasn't about avoiding mistakes. It was about having the humility to learn from them, to analyse them deeply, and to use them as stepping stones towards mastery. His approach to racing in the wet wasn't born from natural talent alone, but from a deep commitment to understanding every failure, every setback, and every missed opportunity. And this was best said by Senna himself.
The main purpose is to succeed, of course, but Many times it's through a mistake, due to your own personality or your own character or interference that you get on the way, that you learn. And the main thing is to make sure you learn through your mistakes and get better.
Back in the 80s, F1 drivers had a race, but all in the same equal cars. And guess what? An unknown driver at the time won. His name was Ayrton Senna. It's an incredible story, and if you want to watch it, just click up here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.